Thanks so much, Jack. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. My name is Miera Cui. I'm a member of the Mission and Peace Committee. And in just a few minutes, we'll be hearing from Danielle Lewis, who from the YWCA Greater Harrisburg's Violence Intervention and Prevention Programs. As you may know, DARE has been supporting the YWCA Greater Harrisburg since at least 1975. And that's part of our commitment to women's equality, justice, and opportunity. Before I invite Danielle to begin her presentation, I just want to remind you that the topic we're talking about today is a heavy one. We're talking about domestic violence, sexual violence. We realize that many of us have been affected by this personally or through people that we love. And so please take care of yourself during this time. I'm sure that Danielle will be providing the number to reach the YWCA as well. And if difficult memories or feelings arise for you, we would encourage you to reach out to them. Over the past several years, with the Me Too and the Church Too movements, we've realized that domestic and sexual violence happen in our families, in our community, and within our churches as well. I'm especially reminded of Pastor Stephen's sermon in December about visiting Matthew's house for Christmas. He talked about how in the first chapter of Matthew's gospel, Matthew names the men and a handful of women who are part of the genealogy of Jesus. Solomon, the son of David, is mentioned, and there's a brief reference to his mother being the wife of Uriah. This Pastor Stephen reminded us that this is a story about David exploiting his power as king to have Uriah killed so that he can have Bathsheba, who was unnamed in the story, for himself. This is a story of murder and sexual assault. The ramifications of David's sin are seen later in the resulting brokenness within his family, as his son Amnon goes on to rape his half-sister Tamar, an example of both sexual assault and domestic violence. We are told that Tamar responds by putting ashes on her head. She tears her robe and she weeps. And she's told not to talk about what happened to her. And her father, King David, does nothing to hold Amnon accountable. In that story, I'm struck by the silencing of Tamar and the ongoing ramifications of this violence within the house of David and the larger community. The writer tells us that Tamar lived out her days as a desolate woman. That language makes me think that the writer is telling us that the story didn't have to end that way, and it shouldn't have ended that way. We can envision a different reality in our communities. At DARE Church, our mission is to proclaim God's word, share God's love, and practice God's justice. I'm so grateful, Danielle, that you can be with us today to talk about the role that we can each play in envisioning a different reality and preventing the harm that domestic and sexual violence causes within our families, our community, and our church, and the importance of believing survivors and responding in a way that can really bring healing and hope. And so with that, Danielle, I want to turn things over to you. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for being here. Domestic violence is something that we experience throughout every community in the US, and it is definitely an important topic during this time. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the variables that go into this. Okay, there it is. All right, so what is domestic violence is the first thing that we should look at. It's a pattern of violence. It's coercive behavior where one partner in an intimate relationship controls another partner, or is forcing, intimidating, or threatening with violence. Now, what makes domestic violence what it is the relationship to the person who is perpetrating the violence. So this wouldn't be some stranger walking down the street. Domestic violence is usually within a family, within a community of people that live together, or it is with a partner relationship. Now, what we see with domestic violence is it does not just affect the people that are in the relationship. A lot of times what happens is it stems out to the other members of that family or of that unit of people, and it affects everyone that lives in that household. So a lot of times what we see with partners fighting and things, it will spill over onto the children, onto maybe people that they're taking care of, like mothers and fathers. So it's not just a couple problem, it's usually systematic within a family unit. All right, so domestic violence knows no boundaries. It can affect you at any age, any ethnic background, any faith, any social economic status, any education, any sexual identity or orientation. So that is something that is really compelling, and we see it all the time at the YWCA, is it doesn't matter who the person is, they can be affected by domestic violence. Anyone can walk through our door at any time from any kind of background. We have people that are highly educated, people that are just, have the high school diploma. We have people that are older. We have people that are younger. Every ethnicity and background we have seen. So it is not something that is isolated to one group of people, is not something just affecting one population of people. It is something that is across our communities at a larger scale. All right, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's nice to lay out what kind of relationships are considered domestic violence. So a spouse or an ex-spouse. So sometimes we know with divorce situations, an ex-partner can become very abusive. That would still be considered domestic violence, even though they're not still with their partner, but it's still a close, intimate relationship. So it's still considered domestic violence. Any kind of partner, including a dating partner. So even if the relationship hasn't been going on for very long, even if it's just dating and not marriage, is still considered domestic violence. Current and former partners. So once again, even if the dating had ended, and this might be months or years afterwards, if that intimate partner comes back into the person's life and is violent towards them, is still considered domestic violence. Parents and children. Now, this is one that we don't think a lot about with domestic violence, but it's one of the big ones. We see this all the time. I actually oversee the person that works at the Child Advocacy Center in Harrisburg. And that center is set up to help survivors and victims who are under the age of 18, who are experiencing sexual violence or domestic violence in the home. So we see cases come through there at least 4 to 5 a day, every day of the week. So this is happening in our communities at a very large scale, and something that we don't always think about with domestic violence. I know I didn't until I started working in this job. So parent to child relationships can be complicated, and unfortunately, sometimes it spills over into violence and is considered part of the domestic violence scale. And also person's relationship by blood, marriage, or with siblings. So a lot of times at the Y, I know we're doing counseling and things like that with families because there is some internal problems. We see a lot of people come through that aren't actually partners, but they might be related in some way. I know recently we had a case where an ex-father-in-law was actually having problems with his stepson from the former relationship, and that's still considered domestic violence because they were actually connected by marriage at one point. So these are relationships that we don't always think about with domestic violence, but they're still considered in that domestic realm because they are part of our home and of our family structures. Okay. So statistics. I wanted to give you some numbers because a lot of times the numbers really speak in volumes. So in Pennsylvania, there was 109 victims that died from domestic violence in 2020. So that is 56% were killed by a current or former intimate partner. Unfortunately, at the Y, we see far too often that some of these cases end in the ultimate violence that leads to death. Unfortunately, victims are, in the firing line and at any point in time could succumb to domestic violence. I pulled out the statistics strictly for Pennsylvania because, that's where we live, and I wanted to really bring it home for us to think about this because it is happening right here in our state, in our counties, in our homes. So it's important to know the numbers of the people that have lost their battle with domestic violence. All right, now this part I'm kind of really happy to be able to present to you, even though the statistics are really bad. But we all know that COVID brought the landscape of domestic violence a whole new level of, intimacy almost. In isolation, domestic violence thrived. And what we saw at the YWCA is people weren't coming in during the first couple months in 2020. March, April, May were low months for us. And that had never happened in the history of our domestic violence shelter or of our services for domestic violence victims. So we began to kind of worry, where did these people go? And what we were seeing nationwide was that this was happening at domestic violence and sexual assault centers everywhere. Because what happened is a lot of people ended up locked into their homes in isolation with their abuser. So they weren't able to get out into the community to come to places like the YWCA, where they could get help and protection. So what we saw was a real disconnect from the people. And that became very scary for us as providers, but kind of a safe haven for domestic violence victims, because being locked up with the perpetrator of the violence could lead to the ultimate sacrifice of death or serious injury. So with COVID-19, it was not the cause of the domestic violence, as we know, but many abusers used the situation in order to gain more control and more power over their victims. So being locked up in the home, they actually used that against the victims. They would do things such as withhold information about the current circumstance with the virus, would not allow for health care to be provided to the victim, withhold personal hygiene products, and many other things they would do during the pandemic in order to kind of bring their victim down and have more control over them. After the initial 3 months, we did see a flooding of people coming back as we came out of lockdown. So during the summer months, when I actually joined the YWCA, we saw a influx or an uptick after about May 2020 of people coming in needing help, because once isolation lifted, we were able to see a lot more people coming back out into the community and being able to come back to our services. So it really was a unique situation. I don't believe domestic violence shelters had ever seen anything like this, and it was a nationwide problem. All right, so domestic violence thrived in isolation. Another alarming trend that we saw during the pandemic was the increased purchasing of firearms. Now, that in itself is not really a problematic thing, but when you look at some of the connecting circumstances with domestic violence and firearms, it does get kind of scary. According to the Pennsylvania State Police database, firearms were up at an all-time high in 2020. So this is coming from our own state police, that there's never been another time in US history that more guns have been bought in our state. This is only alarming because we know that abusers are 5 times more likely to kill their victims if they own a firearm. So I'm not by any means saying that, firearms are a bad thing. But what we do know is that if there's domestic violence in the home and there is a firearm available, it could end very badly for the victims in that circumstance. So these are some of the things that are quite alarming during the pandemic, and things that we had never seen before in US history of the isolation, things that you wouldn't even think would be connected to domestic violence, that ultimately ended up being very critical in our fight to, eradicate domestic violence in many communities. Violence went up during the pandemic, And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of availability to get to the resources that people needed. So it became a very scary situation for a lot of individuals. All right, so now what I'm going to roll into after talking about the pandemic and everything is some of the signs, and also then what you can do as part of that community. If you know someone, if there's a neighbor, someone in your family, what you can do to actually help them. Because I know a lot of times I even felt this way growing up, is I might have knew someone that was in domestic violence, but I had no idea what I could do for them. And that's really an empowering thing. And what we want to do is help to empower you to help those around you or those in that circumstance. So the common signs of abuse that you might want to look out for in your own communities and homes is there's a pattern of putting down the other person. So if you see someone that's constantly putting down their partner or someone in their family, it might be a sign that something more is going on. They might be worried or that they're going to anger, the perpetrator. So if you see someone that maybe is really nervous, it's like, oh, I don't want to make this person mad. That might be a sign that something more is going on. They make excuses for their partner's behavior or anyone in the family's behavior. Oh, they didn't mean it, or oh, there was a one-time thing. So anything like that, you might want to dig a little deeper. Their partner is extremely jealous or possessive of the individual. So if you have somebody that is way more protective or, possessive, taking ownership of a person, this is a red flag of something more. They have unexplained marks or bruising or any kind of injuries. They stop spending time with friends and families or other people in the community. You might even notice maybe they stop coming to church. Maybe they're not showing up, for lunches and stuff that they used to come to. Anything like that, you might want to call and check and see how they are. They are depressed. They are anxious. Their personality has changed drastically. I know we'll see that a lot with people that we're helping. Whenever we first start helping them, they might be very meek and mild and not say much. But by the time we're done giving them help and things like that, their personality comes out. And what we see is a completely transformed person. So a lot of times when people are in domestic violence or a violent situation, their personality completely changes from what it originally was. So look for any signs like this. This isn't always a fail-safe way to see domestic violence. It could be other things going on. But if these things are going on, it might be a good idea to reach out to that person and just to make sure that they're okay. All right, some of the tactics that abusers use is physical abuse, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, isolation, which we just talked about, economic abuse. Now, this one we don't think about too much out in the general public, but it's something we see all the time at the shelter, is that a partner will cut off the availability to maybe a bank account or a credit card. A lot of times they don't allow, the person to work outside of the home so that they don't have their own money. And this is all a tactic to control the other person to make sure that they don't leave. Right? And of course, sexual abuse a lot of times comes alongside domestic abuse. Time and time again, we see these two things being hand in hand, and it's all a control mechanism. It's not because of any other kind of lust or anything like that. It's control is why sexual abuse happens for the most part. Stalking, this is something that we see a lot of. It's very hard to get people help for this. However, the laws are getting better. Stalking happens a lot of times with former partners or with partners that are still engaged in that relationship. So any of these tactics can be used by the abuser to keep control of the person, of the victim. So these are all things to kind of look out for and kind of remember too. Because if you are stepping into a domestic violence situation, even as an outsider, I want you to remember it can be dangerous, even for you. I mean, something that we think about all the time as advocates for domestic violence is safety, because these are some of the most violent calls that first responders get and us as advocates deal with, because at any time, the abuse could spill over into really bad violence. And sometimes bystanders do get, hurt in this process. So just remember, if you are intervening as a friend or as a person from the church, be careful about how you're doing it and watch out for some of these things that are happening, because you don't want to get caught in the crossfire of a domestic violence situation. Also, you should know too when to bring in help. So if there's ever a time where you see physical abuse or violence that is warranted, call the police, call the first responders, get help, because there does come a time that you are going to need, backup if it gets that bad. So just keep that in mind. You can only do what you can do as, a community member. All right, the cycle of abuse. So the cycle of abuse is very calm, is usually where it begins. So usually it's calm, and then all of a sudden the tension starts building, gradually building, and then the incident occurs. So that incident will happen, and then there's a time of making up, a reconciliation, and then it's calm again. So what happens is this happens over and over and over again, and it's very hard to break out of that cycle. So one thing that we see all the time is that people will go back and go back and go back, because the thing is it's not always bad. That's the hard part of an abusive relationship, is there's times where it's good. That's what brings people back to the relationship, is they love the person and they think that they can get better. However, in an abusive cycle like this, it's not going to stop. This happens time and time again, and usually escalates, is what we will see. So the cycle of abuse is very important to kind of know, especially when you're trying to get someone out of a situation. And it's good to know too, a statistic that we hear all the time in this line of work is it takes 7 times for someone to leave an abusive relationship. So it usually never happens on that first time of leaving. All right. All right, some myths and misconceptions. People abuse their partner because they cannot control their anger. Abuse is about power and control. It's not so much about anger. So what is really happening here is the person that's trying to keep control over their victim. It's not just because they have a bad temper. This is something more than just one outburst. This is something that's happening time and time again. All right, a common misperception is that it's alcohol abuse or drug abuse that's causing the domestic violence. Drugs and alcohol are not an excuse for abuse. There's many people that drink or do other things that never lay a hand on another person. So it is just an excuse that alcohol made me hit my partner. That is never okay. There's a lot of people that will, drink and they never touch their partner. So this is something to kind of watch out for. All right, most people would leave a relationship if their partner hit them. Now, I used to think that too. I used to think a lot of people would just leave if their partner became violent. But almost 80% of people who have been physically abused by an intimate partner continue the relationship. So I found that quite shocking and kind of good to know, because people don't leave just because somebody became physically violent with them. A lot of times what ends up happening is they do stay for a longer period of time, seeing if they can work out the relationship, which in its own way is scary, because usually, like I said earlier, it escalates more and more as time goes on. All right, a person could easily leave an abusive situation. On average, it takes 7 times for somebody to leave, and it's not always easy to leave an abusive relationship. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the women that we help, they end up, not being able to leave for financial reasons, or maybe because they have children involved in the relationship and they're afraid for their safety. There's a lot of reasons why someone stays in an abusive relationship. And something that I always try to remember, and I know a lot of the advocates that I work with try to remember, is this person, they do love them. So it's very, very hard to say that somebody that loves me and cares for me and we've lived together and we have children together wants to harm me or would hurt me to the point that I might lose my life or be permanently injured. It's very hard to look at someone in that light that you've shared a good part of your life with. So that is something that I kind of try to think about whenever we're helping someone and maybe they go back, 3 or 4 or 5 times, and we see them coming back to the shelter, back to us for help. We have to kind of give them grace because this is a hard situation. Any way you look at it, it's just difficult. All right, so addressing domestic violence. So identifying the abuse. We talked about that earlier. What are some of the signs? What can we look for? How we can help? Maybe asking, are you okay? Just something that simple. Asking, do you need help? And then reporting the abuse. Now, sometimes I know that things, like I said, are out of our hands. Maybe they do, identify to you that, yes, I have been being abused or my kids have been being abused. Then we know at that point it's above us and we need to call and report the abuse. So that's something you can do very easily by calling the police department, things like that, especially if there's children involved. I would say that is the move that you need to make sure that no harm comes to the children in that situation. Even if it's just the partners that are abusing each other, the children still could be hurt in that situation. So please think about that as maybe you're helping someone, that it is vital to bring in support when you need it. And then what we do at the YWCA and how we would help is a lot of times the police department would then direct this person to us to help get them a restraining order or a PFA or something like that, maybe even give them shelter or resources on how to live without their partner. So we work hand in hand with local first responders a lot of times to get people safe. And we also then work with the Child Advocacy Center if a child line report has come in to make sure that the children are safe in the situation. So here's some resources of what you can do. You will be that number one person that identifies someone in the community, and then first responders and advocates can do their job to help the people that need it. All right, so here's some more things of what you can do besides identifying the abuse. You can actually look at this in several different ways. One of the best ways that you can help an abused person is to listen. So not every time somebody discloses to you that they're being abused, you need to call the police right away. It might be, that they're being verbally abused or psychologically abused, and it doesn't warrant that yet. So one thing you could do as a friend or as part of the church community is listen. The biggest thing that people need a lot of times is just to have that support of their community, of the people that care for them. Try to help the person you care about feel empowered. Maybe telling them, well, hey, you used to work in, a good job, this and that, maybe you could do that again, or you do really great at church and you've helped us a lot. So try to build them up, make them feel empowered again. Because a lot of times somebody that's abused has completely lost their power and control of their life. So leave the decision up to them. I know one of the hardest things as advocates or friends or family members of domestic violence victims is we can't make them leave the situation. That is ultimately up to them. and they might choose to stay. And that is perfectly fine. That is their decision. We have to give them room to make that choice. We might not agree with it. However, ultimately, it is their life, it's their relationship. As long as it's not hurting like children or anything, we have to leave it as it is. Help them to understand that they aren't responsible for the abuse or deserve it. A lot of times what we see with victims, especially with people that are younger, is that they believe that they deserve the abuse, that they actually did something to make the abuser hurt them. And that's something that we really want to make sure as people that are empowering them to make sure that they don't think that. They don't deserve the abuse. They did not cause it. And that will help them kind of realize that, yeah, this is wrong. Because a lot of times they're trying to kind of make excuses for the abuser because, like we said earlier, somebody that they care about. All right, encourage them to seek help from an advocate at the local domestic violence program, which one of them would be the YWCA. So yeah, a lot of times, like I said, it might become too much for you to handle as community members. But if you direct them to our services at the YWCA or another nonprofit that deals with domestic violence, there's advocates there that can help, your friend or family member in many different ways. And I'll explain some of the services that the Y provides here in the next slide or two. All right, so here is our domestic violence hotline is at the bottom. So this is our 800 number. We work 24/7, 365. So if somebody is in a domestic violence situation on Christmas Eve, someone's there at the Y to pick up the phone and talk to them. So this is something that I find very unique about the YWCA is that it runs 24/7. It doesn't matter what the weather's like, what holiday it is. There's someone there to help people that are coming in from really nasty situations. So we serve victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, dating violence, and stalking. We provide support services, and it's always free and confidential. So if you are telling somebody about the YWCA and they're afraid that, information will get out, it doesn't. Everything that is done at the YWCA is completely confidential. We cannot even talk, like if somebody calls in like a lawyer or something, we can't even talk to them about anyone that we serve. So this is completely, confidential. They can feel safe about coming to the Y. They're going to be protected. We operate in Dauphin and Perry County, but there are many other YWCAs in the local area, very similar work to what we do in Harrisburg. So I know there's one in Carlisle, there's one in York. So even if we are not the primary YWCA for the person you're talking to, there are many others throughout the area that would be more than willing to help. And here are some of our services in Greater Harrisburg. We have individual and group counseling, free legal service for filing PFAs. We have the education, prevention, awareness, and professional training is what I do. We have the 24-hour hotline, the emergency shelter for victims. We have the crisis response and intervention team. We have transitional housing. So a lot of times people that come into our shelter, we will help to rehouse them into more permanent housing out in the community. We have safety planning. The first thing that we do when somebody walks through our doors is we sit down and we safety plan with them on how are we going to keep you safe. Accompaniments. So a lot of times victims are afraid to face their perpetrator in court. We have people that will actually go to court with them, go to the police station, hospital accompaniments, anything like that. We will be there with them through the whole process. We have a youth mentoring program to help victims of domestic violence and sexual assault that are younger. We have information and referrals for people, even if they're not in our county. If they call us and maybe they're from Philadelphia or something, we will work with them to get them connected with local resources in order to get them help. Relocation assistance. So sometimes people need to move out of the area to get away from the violence, and we will help provide that to them. So these are just some of the things that we do, kind of in a nutshell, because you don't need to get into major detail about them. But if you have any questions about them, I'm more than willing to open up the floor now for any questions.
I have a question. Oh, I'm muted.
Yes.
Oh, we could hear you, Jane. Now I think you're, can you unmute yourself, Jane? Jane, I think you're muted now.
Okay, now you can hear me. Yes. All right. I'm on the Mission and Peace Committee, but I'm a retired health educator, and I taught in a high school for many years. And I'm wondering if you still provide the programming to come into high schools, because when I was teaching, that was one of the best programs from the community that would come into our classrooms and talk to the kids about the warning signs. And often after those presentations, other students would go to the guidance office or the student assistant team, referring friends that they were concerned about. And a lot of times we were able to get help for kids because their friends knew something about it or they were concerned. And I'm hoping those programs are still available to school districts.
Yes, actually, that's what my team does. I'm actually the director of education programming. So I work with 2 or 3 other educators, and we do go out to the high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, and we even have an advocate for Penn State campus. So we go clear from college on down to preschool. And we do definitely see a lot of referrals, like you were saying, in the high school, middle school levels of people coming into the guidance counselors. We actually work directly with guidance counselors in all our schools to connect with the teachers. So yeah, that program is definitely still going on. We've been seeing some really good results, even though the pandemic has made it a little bit harder. We're still meeting with the kids on Zoom. We're still talking with the guidance counselors and making sure that we have a presence in the school system.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Oh, thank you.
Danielle, if somebody comes to you and you determine that their life or health is in jeopardy, but they don't want you to contact anybody, where is there a line between whether you should go to the police or whether you should keep the person confidential if you really fear that something may happen?
Right.
Thank you.
That's a good question. And that's something that we tackle almost every day. And what I would say is, if you are a friend or family member or a community member that someone's coming to, and you're not sure about calling the police, we get calls like that all the time at the Y, of someone calling and saying, hey, I know that my sister's being abused or my friend's being abused, but they don't want me to call the police. I would say call the Y or call one of the other nonprofits in town that work in these kind of realms. Because what we would do then is try to get your friend or family member to call the hotline, and we would talk to them confidentially about what they could do. And then that might be a way to get them services or get them help, because then you wouldn't be making that call on whether or not to call in first responders. What would happen then is we would make that judgment call. So we would say, okay, they're in intimate danger of getting hurt, or there's children involved that are getting hurt or abused. Then we would make that call of, okay, this deserves a child line. We need to call, authorities. But honestly, unless it's a very intimate danger situation, it's confidential, and we don't break confidentiality unless there is like a child abuse situation or any kind of really bad violence.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle, could you talk a little bit about how the Y is working with first responders? So police officers, you mentioned this a little bit, but police officers as well as medical personnel to kind of identify and to help to work with survivors of domestic violence.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, another part of my team that I've been overseeing is the medical advocacy. And it's been kind of a slow start because we've been looking for someone to fill the position. However, what we do is we work with the hospitals, we work with programming and professional trainings for first responders like police officers, EMTs, nurses, doctors, and we try to get that information out there to them. We've done many programs directly looking at domestic violence, sexual assault, and recently we've been doing a lot of programming about human trafficking and how domestic abuse and sexual assault ties into human trafficking. Because we've been seeing that more and more in our hospitals and also with our own people coming into the shelter. So this is something we've been working very hard to get out into the community and to work with the professionals that are basically on the front lines and are the first to identify that this kind of abuse is going on. So we get a lot of referrals from first responders every day. I know even working the overnights as an on-call supervisor, we get hospital calls day and night. I mean, the last one I got, it was like 2 a.m. So you never know when one of the professionals are going to identify someone in our community, and they'll call in, wanting to get this person's services.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
How large is your team?
Okay. Yeah, well, our team right now, let me think, with everyone involved with the shelter, education, and then direct services like the hotlines and housing, I think we were about 30 people. We have a few more positions that are open that we're trying to fill, and I think once we're to full capacity, we'll be about 40 people on our team. And that's just the prevention ed and the violence part of the YWCA. We also have other services that are held within the building. So we have transitional housing, that's a whole department downstairs. We have a veterans department that works strictly with veterans on medical, housing, homelessness. So there's many different services that are housed all in the same building. And we oftentimes work with those other groups that are part of our team, even though they're not part, of our initial internal team.
Thank you.
Danielle, if anyone is interested in getting more involved with this work, like possibly volunteering, could you talk a little bit about volunteer opportunities and training?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So I actually also run the volunteer training, which is quite intensive, but it is definitely well worth it. So we have a training every fall and spring. Our next one is coming up actually starting in March 7th will be the first day to start for that. And registration is now open. You can see that on our Facebook page. So what you do is you sign up and you do then a 3-week course of several days a week. You come into the Y, or if things are still bad with the pandemic, we'll be doing it over Zoom. And we do a training. And that training is the same exact training that our advocates get from our funders about domestic violence, sexual assault. So there is a lot to it. However, it's very rewarding. And at the end, you actually will be certified as an advocate for domestic violence and sexual assault. So once you go through that training with myself for that 3 weeks, you will then do 2 weeks of shadowing, where you will actually shadow an advocate at our domestic violence shelter or on the hotlines or doing education work. And once you're done with that, then you're a full volunteer and you can come in at any time. You get to pick if you want to do direct service or administrative work, whatever one is better for you. We're more than happy to work with people. I know my last volunteer course that myself and my colleague Christine did, there was one woman that was very interested in our legal services. So she works down at the PFA court. So every Wednesday she'll go down there and she'll volunteer with our advocate, and she'll help our advocate move through the courts because there's a lot of people there. So if there is one part of this work that you're really interested in, we would love for you to sign up for our volunteer training.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Is there anybody else? If not, Danielle, thank you so much for your presentation and putting that all together for us. It was really nice. Had some good questions, and appreciate your presentation today.
Thank
We
you.
thank-
It was
we
nice
thank
meeting all
you.
of you.
Thank you. Everybody take care and thank you.
I'll listen more.
You.
Thanks,
Right.
Mira.
Thank you.